Well, as people grab their food and drink over there and we kind of settle in, first, I just want to say thank you all for coming. I know it's raining. Some of you might have had to swim here to find your way through this awesome library, which is kind of hard to find your way through. So thank you for being here. Super excited for today's conversation. My name is Colin McClay. I'm a professor at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. I do a bunch of things on campus around sustainability, including running the Sustainability Solutions postdoc. I also work on the Arts and Climate Collective, and I run the Annenberg Innovation Lab. Actually, the first thing I want to do is I want to start with the land acknowledgement, and then I want to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do, the plan for today. So I want to take a moment to recognize that California is home to Native nations on whose land we are living, and acknowledge that USC is located on Tongva land. We want to challenge the inaccurate narrative that the state was built by immigrants. Instead, we want to acknowledge that the land we reside on was taken by a settler colonial society that exploited Native, immigrant, migrant, and enslaved people, stealing labor, knowledge, and skills to build what we now call California. As we recognize this history, we must also grapple with what it means to live on stolen land, understand our role and responsibilities as guests on Native American homelands, and be committed to supporting the struggle for Native nations' sovereignty and self-determination. Let's give ourselves a minute to settle in, honor the land by taking 3 intentional breaths. Thank you for that. So we have a great room, and I'm super excited for our conversation today. I want to thank, in particular, ERI, Environmental Justice Lab, Department of Sociology, the Center for Latin and Latin American Studies, and the Presidential Sustainability Solutions Fellowship for co-organizing and sponsoring this. And huge appreciation to Lauren and Rhonda and the rest of the ERI team who've really done so much work to get us here today. So can we just do a quick? And I guess I want to say that this is part of, in this kind of haphazard and sporadic way, a series of conversations that we're trying to provoke with many hosts and all kinds of participants from across the university on, what we could broadly describe as sustainability solutions, like what our future looks like. That is a necessarily interdisciplinary conversation that spans all different forms of research and practice, and really trying to bring researchers and practitioners together from across USC and beyond it. And so we're eager to make these kinds of things in this haphazard way, haphazard and simultaneously intentional way, an ongoing conversation. And so we encourage you to keep coming back, and hopefully we'll be able to have this be a more regular exchange. But today is another great step in that direction. So today, I'm thrilled to be with this amazing crowd. This book, which you will have an opportunity to buy there afterwards and have signed by Manuel, is a lovely and powerful book that really looks at the very specific case of Imperial Valley and Coachella, Lithium Valley, in this deep and long, kind of deep past-looking and forward-looking examination that tells us a lot about environmental justice, about emerging technologies, and about our potential future, both in the region, which is absolutely consequential to all the folks who live there, and so many of us who are affected by it, and more broadly about the just transition and about our kind of environmental and equitable future, right? So this is another, in my view, of kind of Manuel's amazing abilities to look at California as a place where the future comes to happen and see how others can learn from our example. And I think presents in a not Pollyanna-ish, in a very real, complex, messy way, the challenging dynamics and the tremendous opportunity that we have in Lithium Valley. And so I'm really excited to have this group here to talk about it, because we have Manuel Pastor, who you all will know, and in addition to the director of the Equity Research Institute, distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity, and the inaugural holder of the Terpangian Chair in Civil Society and Social Change, joined by Jill Johnston, who's associate professor and director of community engagement in the division of at Environmental Justice Lab in the division of environmental health at Keck, and Juan Lara, who's the inaugural director of Latinx and Latin American Studies Center and an associate professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and a geographer by training. So we have different disciplines represented, all with deep experience in the region. And we're just going to dive in and have a great conversation. The plan is for these guys to start close to 5 o'clock or so. We'll, if we haven't worked you in by then, we'll start working you in. So kind of be saving your questions and interventions. Excited to hear from you then. And then wrap up, there'll be the food and drink, continuing book signing, and hopefully additional conversation. And I hope I did the needful things? Was there anything else we missed? So I think with that, I'm just going to say, Manuel, take us away.
Great, so I'm going to stand up to talk. We are amazed we have so many people in the rain, because in Los Angeles, rain means we completely collapse. We can't drive. We hit each other. We freak out. So really, thanks for coming. I'm gonna also really want to thank both Jill and Juan. They were people who deeply informed this book from the beginning. Jill's great work, which I hope she'll talk about, working with communities there. Juan actually grew up in nearby Coachella Valley, and I think did the first, my first tour in Coachella and Imperial for this book. He both took me to Rancho de Lara, which is the place where his mother lives, and I got to view her pride in him. She has his graduation photos framed on the wall. I also got a chance to have Juan drive me into a bunch of mud dangerously in his car, saying, "I'm sure we can make it." We almost did not. So I'm not sure I owe my life to him or my near-death experience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this book. I always like to let people know, most of you know me, that if my voice is a little harsh, it's because I have the voice condition that Robert Kennedy Jr. has. Makes your voice sound kind of scratchy. I promise I'm not about to take over your healthcare. Apparently he is, although I think I might do a better job. So if you think about the moment we're in, you think about what in Spanish is called la coyuntura, the current moment, the current trends. But coyuntura actually has kind of an implication of the deeper trends that affect this moment. And I would say that we are experiencing three profound crises simultaneously. One is the crisis of multiracial democracy. We have not had it that long. Just as civil rights have expanded, as community movements have asserted their voice, democracy is being snatched away from us by a president and a billionaire gone mad. A reporter the other day asked me, are they trying to destroy diversity? And I said, no, they're trying to destroy democracy. The second big crisis that we face is a crisis of income inequality. The 1% has run away from the rest of us. The share of income going to the top 1% is now 25% of national income. It's never been that high, and it's 2.5 times what it was when Reagan stepped into office and launched the neoliberal revolution, which has redistributed so much money. The third big crisis we've got is the climate crisis, in which the planet is at stake, in which we are causing the kinds of catastrophes that just befell us in Los Angeles, and in which people are beginning to realize that their fates are linked, that what happened in the Palisades also happened in Altadena, and the rebuilding must involve everyone. Now, sometimes when you've got crises that big, and that global, it actually helps to try to think about the specific instances in which they all come together. And one of those places is Imperial Valley in the southern part of California. This is a place which hosts the Salton Sea, an environmental disaster zone. It is a place which is characterized by labor exploitation, reliance on agriculture, and low wages. It is a place that the word racial capitalism was invented to describe, in which there is the dispossession of a Latino supermajority, which finds itself close to poverty and far from power. All three crises right there. And it also happens to be sitting on enough lithium to redo the entire American auto fleet to electric vehicles and have 100 million batteries left over. It is a place that therefore is a place of great excitement for some. It's exciting corporations that are on the prowl for the profits that they can make by extracting lithium. It's exciting environmentalists because, as I'll say in a minute, not only is this key to dealing with the climate crisis, electrifying individual mobility and perhaps mass transit as well, but also the method of extraction in the Lithium Valley, which Imperial Valley has been renamed, is promised to be the cleanest, greenest method of extracting that mineral. It's a place or a moment that is exciting government officials because they can see cha-ching tax dollars coming in as a result of this. And it is a moment, however, that is getting a wary eye from communities and peoples in the region that have been used to being left behind and kept behind and do not necessarily believe that the promises that this time will be different are actually promises that will be kept. So what this book tries to do is to telescope from the biggest reaches of a transition in our economy, of the entire question of what is a social compact in a new American economy, and go down to the granular in the Imperial Valley. So I want to talk a little bit about that and then open it up for my colleagues. Before I do, there's a lot of people who helped with this book, aside from the two compañeros that are up here with me. There's a number of people at the Equity Research Institute. I do want to, there's some who are not here. I think Pita came and left. But I do want to single out two who are here, Austin Mendoza and Eden Pond. Austin did a lot of the mapping and a lot of the interviewing, some of the data collection. And Eden actually took the book to full completion and was the fact checker extraordinaire, who was actually also a complete pain in the ass when he was doing it. He was saying things like, you guys say that, you know, Native Americans used oil for tar in Texas, but that turns out that was in Oklahoma, so you really can't use it in the book. We're like, Jesus Christ, how did you find that out, right? So let's give both of them a big round of applause. So first, what is lithium? Lithium is, of course, the chemical mineral that is used in the assembly of batteries. It is absolutely critical right now because it turns out while there's other ways to build electric batteries that can hold storage, lithium is key to making light batteries that can actually go into cars. And lithium batteries are actually also very key to energy storage. So if we're to move in the direction of wind and solar, we need to be able to store when there's no wind and there's no sun. So lithium is key for batteries, for energy storage. It's also key for electric vehicles. There are three ways of extracting lithium that people know about. One is evaporation ponds. That's done in what's called the lithium triangle. Argentina, Chile, Bolivia. These are big deserts in which they are kind of flooded. The lithium is extracted as it evaporates. It's a tremendous waste of water. And for the indigenous people in the area, water is sacred. And so not only is it sort of environmentally wasteful, it's spiritually rupturing for the people who live there. The other way of extracting lithium, which is done in Australia and then shipped to China for processing, is hard rock mining, which is as bad as it sounds. It's scraping hard rocks. It is uses a whole lot of land. It winds up creating environmental wastelands. It is now being proposed to be done in Nevada because that's just Nevada. That's the way they roll, right? The third potential way of doing lithium extraction is from geothermal pools. Geothermal, there are 3 places in the world that you can to extract enough lithium in concentrate to be able to do this. One is the Rhine Valley, another is the Cornwall former coal mines in England, which is problematic because you don't know what else you'll be extracting when you bring it up. Then the other is Imperial Valley. This what it involves is basically pulling up hot brine, water, salty brine that's deeply has lithium in it. You can use it to do geothermal energy, and then you can shoot it back down into the ground. Potentially, no leakage at all is what the companies are promising, and the communities are worried about. So people are excited about it because it's potentially the cleanest, greenest way to extract lithium. There are currently 11 pre-existing geothermal extraction sites that have been used to power, generate electricity and power in Imperial Valley. The newest site is brand new by a group called Controlled Thermal Resources. And that's the one that looks like they've done the testing and they'll be ready to actually begin to extract at a commercial scale soon. Their site is called Hell's Kitchen, which is kind of going to move us into all the poetry of Imperial Valley. Hell's Kitchen was actually, it was originally a speakeasy and bar that was formed, put in place by a guy called Captain Davis. Captain Davis was not really a captain. He was a failed business person who made like business failure after business failure until he finally was successful with the Hell's Kitchen speakeasy. Turns out that he made enough money to indulge his hobby, which was researching the Donner Party and the cannibalism that took place when the Donner Party crossed to come to California. So this was a place that success led to a continued fascination with cannibalism, which just seems so appropriate for this example. So one of the things that the book does, I'm not going to say too much about it, is actually also talk about the auto vehicle industry, because the social compact of the post-war period, unions and large corporations, was basically formed in the context of the auto industry and the auto strikes that brought that to bear. And then recently, the auto strike of 2023 was about whether or not auto workers would get their fair share of the profits and employment that's going to be generated as a result of the shift toward electric vehicles. But I want to now dive into Imperial Valley. I do want to say one thing before going on. It is easy to think that given the arrival of Trump to the White House, that somehow EVs are going to go off the stage. I want to suggest to you that's not true. It's not true for at least 4 reasons. One, Elon Musk, who is showing that whatever he does will be in his self-interest and therefore partly in Tesla's interest. The second is that the automakers are already deeply invested in moving to electric vehicles. Third, most of their investments have actually occurred in red states, where they have governors who deny climate change but welcome EV investments. And so there's a political constituency for it that's not just environmental and blue. The fourth reason is Chinese automakers. Currently in China, half of the new vehicles are electric. And they now have vehicles that are very high end, but also as cheap as $10,000 that are going to be continue to be made. While they may be able to be kept out of the US auto market temporarily through tariffs, they're going to be in Latin America, Asia, and parts of Europe, and it will be nipping at the heels of US automakers who are going to want to figure out how they can do this, and EVs and lithium will be an important part of this. So why is Imperial Valley interesting, and how's it playing out there? First thing to realize is that if you think about Imperial Valley, the sort of three words to kind of keep in mind are schemes, scams, and scoundrels. This is a place of tremendous creativity. So Salton Sea, many of you may or may not know that it's not actually natural. Although there is a Salton sink there, there's a long history of it sometimes flooding. The desert Coahuila Indians used to either live in the sink or move back up to the hills, with the path being decades, centuries long in terms of their migrations. But the modern Salton Sea actually happened when a company called the California Development Corporation decided that they wanted to bring water to what was then called the Colorado Desert. And they thought that if they brought water to the Colorado Desert, they could create an agricultural industry, which they were able to do. They realized, of course, that bringing farmers to a place called the desert might not work. So they renamed it the Imperial Valley. So how apropos now that it's being renamed Lithium Valley, being named in another get-rich scheme. Now, they tried to bring water to the valley, but they ran into a problem, which is that they were trying to bring it from the Colorado River, and the federal government said, you cannot basically take the water from the Colorado River and bring it to Imperial Valley because this is a navigable waterway. So the California Development Corporation signed a deal with the federal government saying, we understand that, we're going to cooperate with you, and then immediately signed another deal with the Mexican dictator, Porfirio Diaz, to create a canal below the border, to bring it below the border and then up through what is now the Alamo River corridor and flood the valley that way. Great scheme, except they did not build a canal that well. And it broke. And when it broke, it flooded then what was then the Salton Sink for nearly 2 years and created the Salton Sea. It was only fixed up when the Transcontinental Railroad Company said, we're tired of you flooding our railway and we need to fix this up. So they fixed up the canal. They eventually created the All-American Canal that brings the water in right now. So they then had a flooded bunch of water. This flooded bunch of water became the Salton Sea, which in the 40s, 50s, and 60s was considered to be a vacation spot famous for the Beach Boys being there, Frank Sinatra, the Rat Pack, etc. And that became the object of some get-rich schemes. For example, the North Shore Yacht Club, which was built on the north shore of the Salton Sea by a developer named Ray Ryan, who was eventually killed by the mafia because he cheated in a card game. He built a yacht club, which eventually, when the waters rose, fell apart. And he tried to do development and never took off. In Salton City, someone else tried to do a big development, calling it Riviera, the Riviera of the Salton Sea. He sold a bunch of land, built 200 houses, bailed, and then brought a plastics factory in, which is not what the people buying homes were thinking they were going to be living next to. Schemes, scams, scoundrels. And what we now find, well, what then happened, and Joe can talk a little bit more about it, is that the Salton Sea became increasingly toxic, became known for dead birds, dead fish, and eventually for triggering asthma rates in the communities that are 2 to 3 times the national average. So all of a sudden now, people are arriving saying, well, and there's other stories like this, but arriving saying, you know what? This time, we're going to extract lithium. We're going to create local employment. There's going to be good jobs. This should work for everyone. And that has been greeted in the community with great suspicion, great wariness because of the past, great fears about that it really won't be a closed loop system, great concerns about the future that will be made. Now, there is a possibility of things going right, but of course, things have gone wrong so often. What could make things go right is, as we will hear, there's a really sophisticated group of community organizations in place now that are really able to work with and leverage against corporations, local governments, etc. Among them, a group called Comité Cívico del Valle, which is probably one of the most sophisticated EJ organizations in the state, if not the country. A new group called the Imperial Valley Equity and Justice Coalition, formed by young Latinx. I use that word consciously because that's exactly who they are. Latinx, young people who used to had gone out to college but came home during the COVID pandemic, organized for justice, and have been organizing for justice around this development. There have been a interest by labor groups, et cetera, so sophisticated organizations. I think there could be some green consumerism. That is, if people really begin to ask the question, not only am I buying something clean, but am I buying something clean in terms of its labor relations and its community benefits and what it's impacting on the community that could be different. There have been struggles so far around a tax in the community for lithium, which has been a big battle between communities and corporations and local governments. And there's a coalition right now called Valle Unido, which is struggling for a mandatory community benefits agreement. And there are lawsuits that have been filed to try to slow down the lithium development until there can be more assurances about the environmental protection. So this book, which is a really good book, should be bought by anybody, is actually has 2 documentaries being made side by side. One comparing the Lithium Valley with the Lithium Triangle. Another, which will be on public television soon, just about Lithium Valley itself. Tries to go in depth on this, but then tries to jump back out to some big lessons. So I want to tantalizingly say a couple of big lessons, and then I'll close for my colleagues. So one of the things that we draw from our research, is that the traditional environmental message has been go small. It needs to be go big. If we are going to solve the climate crisis, we need to make a conversion at scale in terms of the kind of cars we drive, but also the ways we live. Part of what's wrong with electric vehicles is they're a get out of climate jail free card. You can feel good about your EV even as you live in a sprawling suburban territory. So we need to go big with how we redo our landscapes, urban landscapes. We need to go wide in terms of thinking about a supply chain. People in Imperial County are talking a lot about lithium extraction, but that is the place where the fewest jobs are generated. There are more jobs generated in battery assembly, in EV assembly, and in battery recycling. So it requires thinking about the entire supply chain and combining community organizing with economic sophistication. It requires going public and changing our narrative. By this, what I mean is the following. Elon Musk will tell you what a great guy he is. He will not acknowledge that Tesla has lived at the public trough for years. And the only reason it was able to grow and remains a huge share of its profit is through public subsidies. And the lithium in Imperial County has value because of the environmental movement that's forced mandates, the environmental justice movement that's pushed much of this along. And we too often are in the position of saying, gosh, this industry is going to develop, how can we get some benefits? Rather than saying, we, through our public policy and through our organizing, made this industry possible. And as a result, we claim ownership, not just some share, but ownership, and flipping that argument is important. Two other things. This is about becoming or going a little bit uncomfortable. So let me be clear about this. If we want to move forward addressing climate change, one uncomfortable reality is that it's not going to happen through a lot of co-ops and community land trusts and small things. It's going to require gigantic corporations that can amass the technology and finance to actually extract lithium, to build electric cars, and to do so much else. That is a very uncomfortable thing for those of us who are progressives to recognize. I mean, I got my degree in Marxist economics, and I'm telling you this. But what we need to learn is that what the auto workers did in the 1930s was perfect the art of the sit-down strike to force the corporations to recognize them, and then sitting down to negotiate a contract to actually get the benefits and grow the industry. And developing that set of skills is really critical. And doing that, understanding that we're really not going to change the way we deliver power until we change the way we wield and build power. So community organizing and power building is key. What I want to close with is the following. The book begins probably not where most people would think. The book begins in Spindletop, Texas in 1903. Spindletop, Texas is the place where the modern oil industry was developed. In the early 1900s, only 20% of autos in the United States were powered by gas or oil. 40% were powered by electricity, the remainder by steam. In Spindletop, oil was discovered, pushed into being by a guy named Theo Higgins. Theo Higgins was a one-armed, turns out to be important, person who became an oil explorer and was the person who pushed this into me. Now, interesting story about Theo Higgins is how he lost his arm. He actually lost his arm in a gunfight with a sheriff. Schemes, scams, scoundrels. He lost his arm in a gunfight with a sheriff just after he and his friends had bombed a black church. The sheriff chased him down. They got into a gunfight. Higgins went to an all-white jury in the South that acquitted him because apparently bombing a black church and then shooting a sheriff is okay in that period of time. As my friend Chris says, apparently you can't shoot the sheriff. So what then happened with Spindletop was this discovery of oil that then took the price of oil down by about 90%, led to the discovery of more oil fields in and around Houston and in Oklahoma. The price of gas became dramatically lowered, and we were set on a path of reliance on oil, reliance on autos, reliance on sprawl. An environmental justice disaster with refineries in places that are called Cancer Alley in Louisiana, largely black areas. And a very set of small events in a seemingly small location set off an entirely big set of ripple effects that changed the world and formed the landscape. We think that's happening in Imperial Valley. And so what might seem like a very small thing can actually become the future of the planet. Last word. We say about this book, come for the analysis, stay for the story. That is the stories of Spindletop, of Patio Higgins, of the Salton Sea, of Ray Ryan, etc. And one important lesson that we took away from the book that I'll close on is that we tried to say, how can we not drag people through a lot of verbiage and rhetoric and language that they're used to, and instead tell a compelling story that lifts up equity and community and gives voice to these concerns in a way that feels fresh and new and resonant.
So I'm looking to you two, to however you want to just dive in, either take up some of what he's offered, compliment, or just, and maybe just give a quick introduction to your work a little bit as you get in.
Sure.
I'll start.
Okay, that's fine.
Right.
Hi, everyone. I was sitting up here listening to Manuel talk about a place that is so intimate to me, right? I grew up there. Most of my family is still there. And it was very surreal to hear somebody talk about this place for a number of different reasons. One is because no one has really given a shit about it for a long time. Two, because there was a point where I was going to write my PhD dissertation on the Coachella Valley and the Imperial Valley. And at the time, there was another thing going on. At that time, it wasn't Lithium Valley. It was called the Silicon Border. And it was a combination of Mexicali Valley, the Imperial Valley, and the Coachella Valley, and all of these political leaders trying to figure out how to capitalize on maquiladora production in Mexicali. That fizzled out, and we're in this new era. But at the time, when I told my committee that I wanted to write about this place, they said the same thing. Nobody knows where it is. Nobody's going to care. You're not going to get a job. So write about something else. I ended up writing about logistics in the Inland Empire. But at the time, much like the tour that I gave Manuel, where we ended up at the Duro Trailer Park, which is in the book, that's no longer there. In the early 2000s, I gave Mike Davis a tour, a similar tour. Mike was a professor of mine as undergraduate and then became a friend. And he told me at the time, look, you got to go to Berkeley, you got to study geography, you got to write about this place, right? And what, 20 something years later, I'm finally writing that book that Mike had suggested and insisted that I write. And one of the chapters in the book is called Who Killed the Salton Sea? An Ecological Autopsy. And anyone who's read Mike's books, Mike Davis's books, is familiar with that, Who Killed LA, right? And so I wanted to share just like an intro line that I've written. It's in the works, and hopefully it'll be done in the coming year. But this is one of the lines that in part of the introduction. The environmental degradation of the Salton Sea, which includes increasing dust pollution, which I know Jill will talk about, that is causing harm, and the premature death of Mexican and Mexican-American kids in the Imperial and Coachella valleys, and that has caused the death of tens of thousands of birds, fish, and other wildlife, is and must be treated and discussed as part of a long legacy of white supremacy, capitalist exploitation, and state-enabled ecological violence. One of the things that I've learned and that I've started to do more and more is to stop accepting the constraints of nice phrases like DEI and actually talk about white supremacy and things like racial capitalism more explicitly. And even though much of the discourse and the dialogue around the Salton Sea tends to refer to it as an accident, the argument that I'm making is it's not an accident. What we are witnessing now, the legacies and the histories of ecological violence that is hurting not only the people of the area, but the animal and the wildlife. The wildlife and the, I'll just say it in the words that I'm writing, the flora and the fauna, right, has been sanctioned over and over and over again by the corporations, whether they be agricultural or whether they be other sectors, and the politicians who have repeatedly decided to make this place into a toxic sump, right? It is a sedimentation of generations of ecological and racial violence and class violence that have enabled the agricultural industry in the Imperial Valley, which was all white settlers who came into the area in the late 1800s and essentially established a new industry and created agricultural utopia for settlers in the middle of a desert. And that was enabled not only by the entrepreneurial schemes of people who built the canals that Manuel talked about, but later was codified and sanctioned in the infrastructure projects that were underwritten by the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation through the building of both the Coachella Canal and the All-American Canal and various dams along the Colorado River that enabled that agricultural industry to develop. And it was a deliberate decision, right? Intentional decision to then say this thing that, has historically flooded and become a sea that disappears and comes back over generations is going to stay because we are going to use it as a dump site, okay? That's what it is. It is a dump site for the agricultural industry in the Southern California area that we're talking about. And that agricultural industry has intentionally, again, poured billions of gallons of water that contains pesticides, nitrates, chemicals, that has stored itself over the generations in the water and into the soil. And that is what is being exposed now as the sea dries out. So this is not an accident. And again, it's part of a larger history of ecological, racial, and class violence that has underwritten an entire development scheme. And one of the things that I was thinking about this as I was listening to Manuel talk, and as I've been writing, we are really living on the infrastructural dreams of a settler society that imagined that this was what we should do in the middle of the desert and how we should use the valuable water and the labor that has been used over and over through generations. My family worked those fields. We were migrant farm workers. I remember distinctly, being involved in that industry and what it meant to be a worker in that industry. As a child, I started working in the fields when I was 4 years old, and I saw a lot of kids doing that. And so to hear that now the kids are being poisoned by that same legacy, that industrial legacy of agricultural farm workers, and this time in the form of dust, is absolutely devastating and enraging, right? So I think part of what needs to happen as we think about the emergence of a new industry, and so a lot of us, and I know Manuel has heard this, and probably Jill too, a lot of us hear the promises of the Lithium Valley, and it's just another kind of fantasy in order to extract value from this place. I think Manuel is right, and it's incredibly important to talk about it. One of the things that he didn't talk about when he was making his comments, but he does talk about, and I want to constantly say, Chris Benner as well, right, who wrote this book with Manuel, talked about the commons and talked about sort of the need to think about lithium as part of a commons that then requires us to think about, again, as he said, not an asking for a handout, but saying, no, this is a public resource, right? This is a public resource. Not only people have fought in order to make sure that there's a market for electric vehicles, but the actual lithium itself is a public resource. And what is concerning to a lot of people who have been working on this is the idea that this public resource turning into the Lithium Valley, what it really signifies is a massive transfer of wealth from the public sector in the form of public resources to the private sector in the form of companies like Controlled Thermal Resources. And so while I agree it's incredibly important to start to build the power that is required in order to extract the kinds of things that Manuel was referring to in terms of things like community benefits, agreements, et cetera, we must also deal with the sort of the real challenge, right, of what we are faced with politically, especially now, where we have capitalists running amok trying to sequester as many public goods as possible. The lesson, and I think one question that I had for Manuel is, what do we learn about the limits of where we are now in terms of building the kind of power that is necessary in order to wrestle control, right? To sort of actually manage the commons in a way that is going to benefit the public, right? The greater public. Because as Manuel and Chris write in the book, there have been challenges, even in a state like California, right? In a state like California, where we have progressive officials elected, where we have increasing, as Manuel and Chris write, political representation by local people that are sort of in line and support the idea of creating community benefits. Even in this context, right, we haven't been able to make the kinds of political inroads to demand the kinds of public benefits that are required in order to deal with the generational violence that has been, inflicted on these communities, right? So the fights that were had around the taxes, the fights that were had on what to include in the final plan, right? That did not include mandated community benefits, right? If we couldn't do that, right, in a state like California, what does that mean for scaling up this politics? And it really gets at this question about how do we build the kind of political power that is going to be necessary in order to make demands of the commons and in order to reclaim the commons for the greater good rather than a select group of people that are interested in extracting wealth and value, right? And so I think the lessons from this book is that this is taking place across many communities. What is interesting and important, aside from my own personal connections to it, is that it really speaks to this need of the kind of political context that we're in today and the sort of meshing that I think Manuel eloquently put it together in that last phrase where we're talking about racial capitalism, we're talking about ecological change, and we're talking about a demographics that is requiring a new kind of political vision, right? But it really means that there's a lot of work to do. And at this point, we're far behind. I'll end on a cynical note.
Thank you. I think I come at this from a very narrow perspective of thinking about health and exposures. And I really kind of enjoy thinking through this larger political dimension. I don't get to have these conversations very much. So I'm an exposure scientist and environmental epidemiologist. I come from actually rural Nebraska and spent much time near the border in Texas. And so kind of experienced both very rural communities and also contending with border and extractive economies. I got engaged with Lithium Valley about 10 years ago because of the concern around this idea that was brought up by both Manuel and Juan about thinking about waste, right? So oftentimes what communities are left with when we think about these big economies are waste. And they want to know what that means for their health. Like, what is the damage left behind? And so initially the conversations 10 years ago was understanding, as was mentioned, like this Salton Sea is just an agricultural waste dump. As the sea was shrinking and water was going to be transferred to urban areas, what was left behind? And particularly, what did that mean for the kids that were living and growing up in the valley? And so initially, because it is put also on communities that they have to prove they're being harmed. And so that's oftentimes when they reach out to academics because they need to quantify what that harm looks like. And so the work we did was collaborating with schools near the southern end of the Salton Sea, so the northern Imperial Valley, to look at pollution, measure what was in the air, how that connected back to the Salton Sea, and what it meant for kids' lungs. And so essentially, we demonstrated, which just sort of validated the concerns of the community, was that the air pollution is associated with more wheeze, more asthma, and lower lung function in the kids. And we saw worse effects among kids that live closer to the Salton Sea compared to those that live closer to the border. But with this, it's not just the Salton Sea, because they're living like among this billion-dollar agricultural industry. So there's pesticides, and not only do they spray the pesticides, but they burn the fields. So after the crop, the harvest is done, the fields are just burned. And so that's just another source of, harm to these communities and in these schools. And so as we think more about lithium, what I'm thinking about is what does the waste look like? What's going to be left behind in the communities? And you may have more information, my conversations initially is that all of this new industry coming in is going to be powered by diesel. So all the trucks, all the infrastructure that have to move and build a lot to make this happen is going to be run off of fossil fuels, which we know causes harm. And then there's a potential for generating waste, potentially radioactive waste, and where is that going to go? And the conversations have really shifted from what I've seen politically as, the Salton Sea being something no one wanted. Everyone was staying away for, like it was this wasteland. And now suddenly it seemed as, right, like dollar signs are there. But again, in both cases, like the health of the community hasn't been central to the conversations. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
So, so just you put on the table, which is also present in the book in different ways, the ways that these communities are isolated, historically under-resourced in terms of power, minoritized, facing all kinds of health, economic, political power challenges. And then you have this potential boom, right? We've had not the first one, but this potential boom that Manuel has argued that for society and for our, for the planet is a real opportunity. And so I think the question that I'm left with is, and we there's a plan for this, is what does it look like to address at least some portion of the past harms, the generational harms that Juan talked about, and create future opportunities while still maintaining kind of enough viability that the companies who Manuel has argued are essential to actually extracting and commercializing some of our commons, right? Some of the things that we've invested in as well. So it's like, how do you find that balance? What does it look like? Because I mean, at least I'm not an expert in housing and nor in marijuana, but where California has endeavored to place a lot of weight on affordable housing construction or on legalizing marijuana in ways that haven't really worked out to build lots of affordable housing or haven't really worked out to create an effective legalized marijuana industry. And so what does it look like in this case to set the taxes, the expectations in the right way for the community and for the country? How do we get there?
That's your question, man.
So, I'm gonna try to be brief, but the first thing I want to say is Juan's book is gonna be fire. Just, we've been co-creating, at the same time, and I'm just so eager to be able to read that when it's done. I think that we are looking at a test case of
Mhm.
how this is gonna work out. And I mean, the interesting and complex thing in Imperial Valley as well is that there's three main corporate players in what will be the lithium space. One is CTR, which is an Australian company that domiciled itself in Delaware and moved its CEO to the Imperial Valley so they could say they're local.
Mhm.
Another is Energy Source, which has only one plant. And then the company that has 10 geothermal plants and just filed plans for 3 more is Berkshire Hathaway. Might have heard of them, Warren Buffett. So they're actually sitting around waiting for the political conflicts to be settled so that they know what the terrain is. And really, I don't think there's an easy, at first I didn't think we'd be talking a lot about marijuana today, but that's fine. But I don't think there's a easy, but the parallel here is that that's been about the creation of a new market. And the rules for it weren't very clear, and there were reparations aspects to it, meaning that if you're creating a marijuana market, creating an opportunity for people who got caught up in marijuana laws previously is critical for people to get assets. That's a little bit about what's missing. I'd be interested to hear particularly what Juan says about this in this space, is there's not a lot of talk about climate reparations.
Mhm.
To some extent, the fight around the excise tax led to the creation of some funds
Mhm.
to repair the Salton Sea,
Mhm.
but not to repair the people who have lived by the Salton Sea. And I think the language of climate reparations and what is owed a region that's been the recipient of so much that Juan was talking about, how we develop the language. And then, frankly, I think Juan raised a really important question about political power.
Mhm.
Because if we can't pull off more than we have in California, when the governor says he's committed to equity, when he's definitely committed to the Lithium Valley, what's the terrain we're really working on?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I wish we had 10 more years to sow the ground, right? I think because one of the challenges that we've faced in that region is the lack of kind of building the social glue and the social infrastructure to be prepared for the onslaught that has come because of the Lithium Valley. And I think one of the things that Manuel and Chris write about is the development and the emergence of a new sort of leadership group among youth that are organizing and see climate issues as an important part of what they're working on, right? And so the ability then, and there have been these tensions between this emerging youth group of leaders and an older block of leadership in organizations. And there has been a challenge with sort of building some political power and some tensions and divisions. But for the law, I mean, we need to understand, right? The idea of a community benefits agreement, the idea that a bunch of people, very poor people, right, in this region can go and demand and sit at a table with supervisors, right? That is a huge deal in a place like the Imperial Valley, and even to a certain extent in the Coachella Valley until more recently. And so building that kind of the sort of the knowledge, the vocabulary, the kinds of ideas about linking sustainability to political reparations around climate and all of those things are relatively new ideas that haven't had time to diffuse through the larger populace there. And so part of the work that has happened, and Manuel writes about an organization called Alianza en Coachella. Comité Cívico has a longer history there tied to the farm worker movement. The farm worker movement actually, the UFW had an office in both Mexicali and in Imperial Valley because they saw themselves as a regional labor movement. As Manuel and Chris write about in the book, there's a long history of people moving back and forth between Mexico, Imperial, and Coachella valleys. But this idea of how do we build that kind of social infrastructure to sort of make these kinds of demands and to organize to be able to extract these kinds of community benefits, that is where so much work needs to be done still. The leaders that have emerged as part of this process, the person who headed the commission on the Lithium Valley, comes out of a project that the California Endowment funded for 10 years exactly to do this, to build leadership, to build social networks and infrastructures and community organizations in order to tackle these vaccine problems and vaccine issues. And so I don't think that was a mistake. I don't think, I mean, or an accident, let's just say that, right? And so I think more of that needs to be done, and more of that type of work and conversation needs to be included in our conversations around sustainability, right? Because if we're talking about sustainability, it's not just a kind of natural ecological sustainability, it's also a community sustainability. It's a kind of sustainability for the kinds of communities that we want to live in, and that means building the kinds of democratic power that Manuel alluded to at the beginning of this conversation, right? And so that's sometimes what's frustrating, and it has been a historic sort of problem with environmental conversations, that we focus on certain ideas about nature and the environment that don't include these kinds of social issues that really require an ecological framework rather than just an environmental framework. And I use the term ecological very deliberately to say it is really about, you know, the systems and the relationships between humans and more than human life, right? And that means we pay attention to our communities and community power and sustainable forms of life that allow us to engage in these kinds of conversations and struggles to build the kind of natural world that we want, right? And so I think those conversations need to happen. That means that, you know, this is the work that we're doing, right? I think all of us in our own ways is addressing, you know, and entering into conversations around sustainability and nature and the environment that's kind of pushing that agenda and pushing that vision, because we need to talk about these larger things if we're going to move forward to deal with the much bigger pressing issues that we are confronted with.
Just two quick comments on that. First, anybody who has written or will write a book, you'll discover that one of the frustrating things is when you're done with the book, you come up with all these really cool phrases that you should have had in the book, like schemes, scams, scoundrels. It's not in the book, but it came up in the talks. The other one is the balance of the speed of trust and the speed of the market. So trust takes a long time to build, but man, this is a runaway train in terms of what capital wants to do, where policy is moving, et cetera. And so how do you both slow things down on one side and speed things up on the other? The other thing that's really fascinating, it kind of pops through in the book, not as much, but there's a really interesting set of questions about inside, outside in the following way. Juan is right to talk about Alianza Coachella. The woman who heads that, Sylvia Paz, comes from the same high school as Juan. That high school has produced leader after leader after leader, and they really took over a big part of politics in Coachella Valley. There actually could be more useful alliances between Coachella and Imperial, but Imperial, that's been often so isolated, is kind of worried about people from the outside of whatever ilk having too much of an influence who haven't been native and local. And that's another thing that one needs to balance is if you're in an area that's under-resourced, hasn't had a BHC type investment, building healthy communities type investment in building local community leadership. And there aren't great community leaders there, Comité, IV Equity, several others. How do you balance the taking the outside assistance and other people delivering it, do it in a way that's not arrogant, but helpful? Everything is happening in Imperial Valley.
We're gonna keep talking, but I want to get to like invite people to who have questions, think about their questions, comments, to kind of get ready to work y'all in. So I'm looking to you and you can raise hands as they come up. You want in?
Sure.
All right, go for it.
Well, thanks a lot.
You should say who you are too.
I'm also Lara from the University. I was really intrigued by your comment about the young people working in leadership, and I'm wondering if you could say more about what are they doing, how do they organize their power, what tactics are they using, or how do they manage to be successful to an extent? What kind of alliances do they make with the older people? How is that working? That seems to be a somewhat unique chemistry.
Yeah, well,
Sure.
oh yeah, so the question was about if I could speak more to the ways that young people are organizing and how this new sort of leadership group of young people have been trying to organize around issues of politics and power in the Imperial and the Coachella Valley, and they're very different. So in the Coachella Valley, there has been this period in which the Eastern Coachella Valley, which is the city of Coachella, to some extent the city of Indio, and then the unincorporated communities that are called Mecca, Thermo, Oasis, and North Shore, all of those places have had roughly, at least since the 1990s, political leadership that has looked more like themselves, right? So they're sort of older, white, sort of a business class moved out to a large extent, and the political leadership changed to an almost all Latino leadership, right? That doesn't mean that the policies have been any better to a large extent, except that you started to get and Manuel and Chris write about this, and we've had conversations about this. You started to get people who were going away to college, which was very difficult, I will say, because when I was in school, there was a 50% dropout rate from the high school. I think 1% went to college, but slowly over the years, people were going to college and then coming back and asking, what am I going to do now, right? And so there started to be some movement around getting community involvement and focusing on education. A lot of people became teachers. And then those teachers were trying to get their kids to go to school. And then they were coming back and getting involved in politics. But more importantly, and this is something right up your alley, they became involved in arts and culture organizations. And they started arts and culture. They started mural projects all throughout the city. They got involved in that way, and that also led to more political involvement to the point where then people started running for elected office, as Manuel talked about. But there is still that kind of, through that arts and culture, then preparing people to run for, like, being on the board of the College of the Desert, et cetera, and extending their kind of reach in that way. And then trying to fund and trying to get funding to establish nonprofit organizations. But for the most part, the philanthropic world has not paid much attention to that part of the state. In the Imperial Valley, that's been much more recent. Even though there are these historical legacy organizations, there's a new generation, very much like what happened in Coachella 30 years ago is happening now in the Imperial Valley, where people are coming back, moving to places like Brawley, places like Calexico, and saying, what are we going to do? How are we going to organize? A strong contingent, both in the Eastern Coachella Valley and in the Imperial Valley, of queer identified activist organizers who have been subjected to a lot of violence, right, because of their identity, who are now insisting on organizing on that very platform, right? And so there is a kind of very progressive organizing among young people that have been happening, but it's kind of staggered, and the connections haven't happened at a regional level. And Manuel and Chris mentioned how some of the political divisions are tied because they're in two different counties, and that creates a lot of that kind of division. Increasingly, people like Veronica Terriquez and some other folks are trying to get people to come together and to learn from each other and to organize, but that's a very slow process. I don't know if I missed anything, Manuel.
The two things I would add are first, that within Imperial itself, there's also generational tension between an older guard of Latino leaders and this younger guard that is, very different. One of their big things now is a new zine they just put out. So they've got a different set of attitudes, different styles of organizing. Everybody's figuring that out. We actually dedicated this book to the youth of Imperial Valley because we were so inspired by what they were doing and by something that, again, I thought about, kind of wish I'd put it in the book, and then I had put it in an article that's in the scene, which is that years ago, and Juan definitely knows this, that the expression, if you're from Coachella or from Imperial, is "sal si puedes," leave if you can. And now the new expression is "aquí me quedo," here I stay. Here I stay to make my life, to make a difference, to be with my community. And that is actually something very new, to see people with professional skills who are not looking to make it elsewhere, but looking to bring that back. And that feels very, very, that is very new, partly because now more people have those experiences, but also I think there's something very searing about COVID and the way in which essential workers, like in agriculture, were essential for work, but not essential for care. And that fact that young people saw their parents, their uncles cast away, chewed up, in ways that were always there, in the ways that Juan was talking about, but just became so vibrantly clear in terms of not being cared for. I think that was really a searing moment.
As these struggles for
Hey, we
Shall we-
Yeah, I want to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Kukulkan, I'm one of the sustainability postdoc fellows. So as these movements and organizing efforts for environmental justice in the valley continue to develop, what are some ways that we can build solidarity here in Los Angeles? Are there any, like, for example, are there groups of workers in Los Angeles who might be strategically located along supply chains, or are there logistical choke points or things like that that would be particularly strategic to pay attention to in the next 5 to 10 years?
So first, look into the work of a group called Jobs to Move America, which is trying to leverage a lot of outside power and inside power to try to change conditions. I think that would provide a number of different entry points. I think supporting with research, both the workforce development stuff, but also the environmental concerns that communities have. I think that's really critical. Joel, I'm wondering if you could think of other ways that people could help.
Yeah, I mean, I think within LA and some of the leadership in the environmental justice movement here, there's been these historical relationships between LA and the Imperial through freight transport, right? Because a lot of goods cross over the border, or increasingly like warehouses are moving and even going down into Imperial. And so there's active conversations as folks here are working towards zero emissions technologies right now, thinking about how to build more solidarity in the conversations around lithium and what's happening in Imperial. I think a second place where it's new, but I don't know, coming is around battery recycling. And so there is still a lead acid battery smelter that's in the city of Industry, so in the eastern part of LA County. It does lead now, but it's talking about being able to grow and take in lithium batteries. And so there's communities that have organized around the harm from that facility. And so, I mean, this is another place where we see this whole cycle here in Southern California around batteries potentially. And so also a place to build both understandings about what it means for health, but think about strategies to build power.
I'm looking if there are other questions. I mean, I have a little follow-up. It seems like another area that was in the book is the kind of European movement to do battery passports. And so there are kind of policy, I mean, we were talking before we began about raising awareness of consumers that it's not just that lithium comes from somewhere and that's unfortunate, but that lithium comes from very specific places, and it is more than unfortunate for or potentially more than unfortunate for those communities, right? Raising awareness and also creating kind of a chain so that you can imagine ethically sourced. That's not something that's happening in the United States, but in Europe, there's a movement there, right?
Yeah, that's an important thing. It's certainly something that Chris Benner, my co-author, was here. He'd be talking a lot about. One of the things this is our 6th book together, and we complete each other's sentences, but that means that half the book I don't really understand. But that part's well written too. So I think that's an important part of it is what's our responsibility as consumers as well to try to think about what we're buying. The lithium battery recycling thing is going to be huge. I don't know whether people have been tracking, but there's a lithium battery fire in the Monterey Bay, started about a week and a half ago, still isn't out because lithium just keeps burning. And is one of the big things in the fires right now, which is that they're like, oh, those EVs, it's kind of bad. We can't track them out because they just kind of blow up every once in a while. That they just really don't. Water doesn't put it out. Sand doesn't put it out. They just keep burning. So I think we tend to think of electric vehicles as a get out of climate jail free card instead of thinking about all the different consequences. I know that we're going to close up. I did want to make sure that other folks have a chance to say something, but also that I have a chance to sell something, which is, I think it's March 3rd. Is it noon or 4 p.m.? Noon. We are, PRI is putting together a session called Chaos, Control, and Compassion, Supporting Immigrant Rights Research and Resilience, which will be looking at the question of immigrant justice in this first couple of months of the Trump administration. It's bringing together scholars from political science, from Keck, from the law school, and one of our scholar activist folks, Cynthia Buisa, who used to the California Immigrant Policy Center. So if you liked this, you'll like that even more. So let me see whether our folks want to add something to close, and then Colin, you can talk about a lot about the sustainability.
So yeah, I mean, just briefly, I think one, considering like health, it really needs to be core when we think about sustainability solutions and think about who's benefiting and who's paying the cost and whose health is paying the cost. And sorry. And finally, if folks haven't been to Imperial, I encourage you to go check out the Salton Sea, check out the communities. Like it's kind of an amazing place and, you know, I think very different from LA, but we talk about it, but it's really important to see it.
I actually had a question for Jill, but because one of the things that I've been reading now is and looking at is we actually do not know enough about the impacts of increasing, you know, drying out of the Salton Sea. There is still debate about where most of the toxic exposure is coming from. Is it coming from the exposed playa? How much of that it has to do with, you know, evaporation of the water itself? And all of this, you know, scientists, you know, at UC Riverside, at UC San Diego, at UC Irvine, and some, you know, some of the work that's being done out of USC, we're asking questions like, what do we really know about what's happening here? Do we need to study this more? And at the same time, there is this pressure. We're going to lose out. There are other forms and other locations where lithium is located. We need to fast track this as much as possible. We cannot burden the companies with a lot of regulations or kinds of benefits for communities because they're going to just drop the ball. They're going to say, it's not worth it. We're going to move out. And so it's a very tenuous moment that we're dealing with. And I think for as scholars, right, it's important to highlight these things. I think I'm not in the position where Manuel is, where he has to talk about policy because people want to know what they can actually do. My position is just like, no, let's be critical. Let's ask tough questions, even if we don't have the answers to that. And I think so for Jill, I'm just curious, like, how much don't we know that we should know about what's happening? You alluded to some of the waste. We know that there's this potential for actually generating waste from lithium extraction itself, right? And yet we don't have a lot of answers, and we're pressing forward, right? Because of this concern that we're going to lose out on this sort of momentum that's in the market.
Yeah. So just to respond to that, I think, you know, thinking about this idea of the precautionary principle is important. I think there's a lot we don't know. And as Manuel talked about these different lithium technologies, like this is something that is new. So a lot of it is speculation. One, if it even work, but two, what is it going to look like really for the communities and what are the impacts going to be? But I think with that, it's critical to kind of build on these other like boom and bust economies, as you brought up Texas. If we look at all these other communities that have contended with extraction, I mean, I think likely we're going to see a lot of those impacts. And I think it's important that we don't do nothing in the face of uncertainty, because oftentimes when I started working down there, they were saying like the dust that comes from the desert, like it doesn't harm people. And so it takes, you know, a lot of time to like build that evidence and the narrative that like, yes, there's desert, or there's dust from the desert, but there's also kind of this additional impact of the Salton Sea. And so kind of being comfortable moving forward with uncertainty, but in ways that really tries to be protective of public health, which we're not good at doing that with policy, but you guys probably have brilliant ideas on how to make it happen.
So I keep wondering, how did I wind up with policy instead of pros, Juan? But thank you everybody for coming. We had a chance to thank some of the researchers and to thank Lauren and Rhonda, not in the room, and doing work outside, holding this together, is Paris Floria and Deborah Gata. Can we give them a big shout out so they can hear it?
Just one quick comment on for folks who are interested in where policy is now, the Imperial Valley, what's the name of the commission?
Lithium.
The Lithium Valley came up with the February draft of its specific plan, which has about 150 pages of stuff. I will let you should be the judge of the substance of that stuff and how it reflects the conversation you've heard today. And I really want to commend the book to you, not just because we're sitting here together, but because it's really good. It's about 170 pages of prose. It's a quick read, super engaging, and I think really does, in the way that you've heard just a slice of, brings out the history and the tremendous complexity of this moment, of the problems that we have to address that are pre-existing, of the opportunity that lies before us, and of the complexity of agreeing within these different communities. And I think, Manuel, you raised the kind of speed of trust and the speed of the market. And to me, like, I think that's in so many ways the crux of this. And it's about finding that balance, because we all need to make this work. And I think there is a yes there, but if you look at history, we don't often get to the right yes, right? We end up in a place that has led us to these kinds of environmental, social, human crises that we're, kind of these sacrifice zones that they're rife in this area. So I really want to encourage you to get the book. Manuel will be up there signing. Stick around and talk to each other. And again, please join me in thanking this fabulous group for sharing their awesome book.